The Canadian Fuels Association has made notable strides in environmental sustainability. Now, the Vice President of Western Canada, David Schick, joins us now today from Ottawa to discuss their efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in refineries and enhancing energy efficiency in Canada. David, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thanks, Al. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, can you provide kind of an overview of the Canadian Fuel Association's key initiatives aimed at enhancing environmental sustainability in the energy sector?
For sure. Well, first off, the Canadian Fuels Association represents about 95% of the transportation fuels that we use in Canada. And we have 15 refineries that produce those fuels to get them to market. And so we see a change in the way the world is working, where we have to have environmental sustainability at our forefront of our business, but we also need to make sure that we're maintaining an affordable and reliable fuel supply to Canadians. So a lot of the things we're doing right now are in response to policy changes, but also because the market is demanding these lower carbon products. And so what we're working with is the finished fuels have to have a lower carbon intensity, is what we call it, so they're not as environmentally impactful. And to do that, we do a number of different things. We blend biofuels, for instance. We're working on putting in electric vehicle charging stations in a lot of our retail sites. And the refineries need to be improved on a life cycle basis to make sure that these lower carbon intensity fuels get to market, and we're making them in Canada.
So, David, what are some of the things you really wish people knew about Canadian energy? Just how clean it is, really?
Well, I think it's the strength of the Canadian energy system and how it needs to evolve. So we have a wonderful resource in Canada around our oil and gas sector. They're making tremendous strides on the upstream. We're working on it on the downstream. But the great opportunity we have in Canada with the expertise and infrastructure that we have here and the biomass that we can use to make new types of fuels is to make sure that we're complementing our existing strength of industry with these new products to get them to consumers and have environmental benefit and still have a robust economy.
Now, David, can you share some new technologies that your organization has implemented to really mitigate environmental impacts?
Well, I think that it's not necessarily our organization. We're working with all of our members, which are all of the major refiners and distributors of products in the country. Some of the things that they're doing is really interesting is co-processing, which is taking renewable feedstocks that aren't crude oil, that have lower environmental impact, and blending those with traditional crude oils to make these lower carbon products. This utilizes the existing infrastructure in the industry, and it doesn't change what we need to have in for our fleets. The finished fuel is the same, but it allows us to make these products with a much lower carbon intensity. So this involves gathering up different feedstocks. So the canola industry is a tremendous opportunity to use that product for new fuels. Another thing that we're doing is having facilities built. A great example is the Imperial facility in Edmonton at Strathcona, where they're building a renewable diesel plant, which is 100% renewable feedstocks that can be blended with traditional diesel to make these products available to consumers. So it's all about carbon sequestration is another opportunity, but all of these different pieces put together to try to make sure that we can continue to utilize our fleet, utilize our existing infrastructure, but have much less carbon impact on our communities.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has been talking a lot about hydrogen recently, saying it's not just the future, it's now, and she wants to make Alberta a hydrogen leader around the world. What are your thoughts on that?
We produce a lot of hydrogen in Alberta, and the opportunity with the Edmonton hub is a terrific one because there's a lot of refineries there that make hydrogen, and the hydrogen is necessary to break down the crude oil to make these products that we make today. So hydrogen is a tremendous opportunity for the future. It's going to take time to scale up in order to make the environmental benefit that we're looking for, but we see it as a key part of the energy future over time.
So, David, in what ways have you collaborated with government agencies or environmental organizations?
Well, all of the policy development that's been going on, the clean fuel regulation is a great example at the federal level. We started working on that in 2016 and 17, and it took 6 years to get it to where we are today. So we're working constantly with the provincial and federal governments, trying to have a balanced approach to making sure that we can maintain a reliable energy supply while making sure that the environmental sustainability opportunities are realized, and also building up opportunities for investment in Canada, which we think is really critical to the long-term opportunities. So we need to work with all of these different stakeholders and different sectors that can provide new types of feedstocks for us The carbon sequestration is a big piece too, developing hydrogen for markets. So we really work with a broad spectrum of stakeholders to make sure that we're engaging all of the necessary parties. The collaboration is critical because transitioning an energy system can have tremendous impacts on the economy and on the consumer. And so how do you mitigate that with still keeping tension on the system to improve our sustainability goals?
The federal government has set aside some very ambitious goals of net zero emissions, like the year 2035. Alberta Premier Daniel Smith says, no, maybe it's more like 2050. What are your thoughts when it comes to net zero emissions? Is it really achievable?
It's going to take time and it's going to take a lot of effort. So I think that the goals are extremely ambitious by the federal and provincial governments, depending on what province you're in. But I think it's the intention that's critical. And I don't think we're going to be able to get to net zero in 2035. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be taking the steps that we can to improve sustainable performance in all of our different sectors, and transportation being the big one for us, which is over a quarter of the emissions in Canada. I think that we need to find the common ground around the practical application of these new policies, and balance that against the ambition to make sure that we're actually making changes that we're looking for. And our members are committed to producing and distributing more low carbon fuels. But it is going to be a challenge to meet the timelines that are in front of us, because there's a lot of overlapping policies too that we need to understand in order to create investment certainty we need to be successful in getting these things done in Canada.
So let's flesh out more about some of the measures that have been taken to enhance energy efficiencies in Canadian fuel refineries, and what results have those efforts really yielded so far?
Well, I think some of the big things that we've been doing so far are carbon sequestration work that's being done at Northwest Redwater is a great project. In British Columbia, the refineries at Tidewater and Prince George, and in Burnaby at the Parkland refinery, they're doing co-processing and making these new fuels. So those are important steps. We're working with government on some of these incentive policies to make sure that we can improve refinery performance as well, because we're competing against capital demands from the US under something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which creates a lot of incentives to invest in the United States. And it's an industrial policy rather than a green environmental policy. And so we want to make sure that we leverage those opportunities to utilize our products and resources we have here for the future. So a lot of what we're doing as a sector right now is taking traditional biofuels, renewable diesel, biodiesel, and ethanol, and blending them into vehicles and building that structure, as well as building those facilities. A lot of our members have these types of businesses now. For example, Federated Co-op and Suncor have very large ethanol facilities, for example.
Here's a question I have for you. When I was a kid, I remember the diesel was considerably cheaper than regular gasoline. But now it seems to be the opposite. Every time I drive by a gas station, see, diesel seems to be 10 cents a liter more. Why is that?
Well, there's the decarbonization of our energy system really has some sectors that are much harder to decarbonize than others. So in the light duty vehicle sector, we can blend more ethanol, and electric vehicles make sense. Well, electric vehicles don't make a lot of sense today for aviation, for rail, for marine, and long haul trucking. So diesel becomes more in demand because it doesn't have the opportunities to decarbonize with some of the other methods that are in front of us in terms of alternatives. So that diesel demand, we can improve the diesel performance in terms of its environmental impact, but that product is going to be necessary for a longer period of time because the electrification of light duty vehicles is more practical than it is for some of these larger transport.
So it's all about supply and demand here, obviously. David, what strategies and technologies are being employed to minimize water usage and really promote responsible water management in the refining process?
Well, I think that one of the critical things is that every dimension of the refinery needs to change and improve. So we have the GHG performance, which is all of the carbon impacts that we're working on, but we also are having more and more stringency attached to air emissions and water emissions as those policies become more stringent as well. So increased monitoring of these products and making sure that everything that we do is more and more responsible as we respond to the needs of environmental performance. So in terms of water, It really depends on the individual refineries, but we want to be minimizing all of the inputs that we have going into the refining process. And for instance, when you talk about hydrogen, one of the primary ways of making hydrogen is using water through electrolysis. And so we need a lot of electricity and a lot of water. How are we going to do that in such a way that doesn't adversely affect other parts of the community?
So how does the Canadian Fuels Association really address concerns about the environmental impacts of transporting fuel products, such as maybe pipeline spills and emissions from transportation?
Well, that's a big part of what we do. So the Canadian Fuels Association traditionally used to be called the Canadian Petroleum Products Institute. We do all of the driver training of the fuel truck drivers. We coordinate that through third parties. We work with different committees within our members to try to make sure that we have strong sharing of best practices when it comes to environmental usages, something called the National Distribution Committee for us. So that works on trucking practices, make sure that we're monitoring and maintaining our emergency preparedness. And I'm very proud of the sector. Actually, right now, today, we're working and accepting an award for the response to the BC floods because our members did a tremendous job in making sure that the fuel supply was maintained when we went through that environmental or climate-related challenge a couple of years ago in British Columbia.
Well, congratulations. Now, what steps are being taken to ensure that the Canadian Fuels Association really remains at the forefront of environmental innovation and sustainability in the future?
Well, what we're doing is really what I call broadening the tent. We understand that the oil and gas sector is going to be critical for us, but we need to be working with other sectors, with environmental groups, with the agriculture sector, which can provide us with feedstocks to make these fuels. We're working with forestry, who have that opportunity as well. We stay in closer contact and work with the electric vehicle manufacturers, the automakers, to make sure that we're optimizing the individual opportunities that we have in front of us. We work closely with, or starting to work more closely with universities and making sure that the research goes into areas that are not just academically interested, but help us meet our compliance obligations as well. So it really needs to be a full spectrum approach, and to working with different sectors, looking what's going on around the world. We work closely with the International Energy Agency on some of these opportunities, what we're seeing in other jurisdictions, and sharing those with our members and making sure they're part of those conversations so that we can stay at the forefront of future improvements in this space.
So how does the association really balance the need for economic growth and energy security with the imperative to reduce environmental impacts?
That's the balancing act, because we can't have a situation where the consumers can't tolerate these higher prices, which we're seeing right now. We have an affordability challenge in Canada and around the world, and yet we still have an imperative more strategically to make sure that we're meeting our climate change goals. So one of the things I think is important is that, as I've described, we can make these fuels much more environmentally friendly, but still maintain the same fleet. Now, that's much more intuitively, that's much more cost effective than changing out the fleet and making everybody have new electric vehicles, which requires grid changes and all that. That's going to be important, and it's a piece of the puzzle. But we want to make sure that we're optimizing the opportunities that are fit for purpose, to make sure that the costs are being maintained or are affordable for consumers, and yet we're still making the changes that are necessary in order to move forward on our environmental goals. So that is a constant balancing act for us, is that we can't have the pendulum swing too far one way or the other. Otherwise, we're going to be compromising our economic opportunity for future, because the world is demanding these things. And also the consumers need to be able to afford and live a comfortable life in a size of Canada, and transporting goods and services and people around necessitates that we have an affordable energy system.
You know, David, some critics of the Trudeau government are shaking their heads saying, why do you want to phase out oil and gas when there's so much of a need across the world right now, and Alberta has an abundant supply where we can help Canada really flourish economically? So what do you believe is the future for oil and gas here in Alberta?
I think it's a bright future. I work a lot with the upstream side of the business. And Canada is producing these products responsibly, where in other parts of the world they're not. And the world is still going to demand and need these products for many decades to come. So let's make sure that the world understands how responsibly we're producing these products, and make the changes. And I view a lot of these alternatives as complementary, like hydrogen, like biofuels. Doesn't mean you take oil and gas away. You're supplementing what we're doing with our traditional oil and gas industry in a responsible way. And we want to make sure that we're supporting those initiatives on the upstream side, when we're producing the oil and gas, with things like the carbon sequestration opportunities we have with organizations like the Pathways Group. All of those things are tremendously important. And then we leverage that expertise that we've developed in Canada, which we're world leaders in now, and share that around the world. I think that, it's the opportunity for our products to be recognized for the environmental improvements we made and the quality that they have today, and then also share those services around the world so that other countries can benefit from what we've learned here.
David Schick is the Vice President of the Western Canada operation for the Canadian Fuels Association. David, thanks so much for joining us today from our nation's capital in Ottawa.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being part of your show.